Up everyone, Rava here, with the first episode of The Reader's Block, a brand new series here on the channel, where I'm going to be reviewing some books that I have recently read, give you my general thoughts on it, what I liked, what I didn't like, and of course give it a rating out of 10, which we'll be putting down on paper so it's on record. And for the first episode here, I have The Left Hand of God. Listen. And of course you cannot review a book without some tea. So there I have some Heath and Heather organic raspberry leaf. Any British people watching, make sure to leave me your tea recommendations down in the comments. So, The Left Hand of God. First book of a trilogy under the same name, written by Paul Hoffman. Published in January of 2010, so it's been quite some time. And over the time that it's been out, it has collected a lot of really good reviews. 3.6 out of 5 on Goodreads, 4.3 out of 5 on Amazon, 7.4 out of 10 on Fantasy Book Review, and 92% of Google users liked this book. So it has been received really well. But is it really that good? I don't know. Let's talk about it. This book will throw you into a very confusing world, full of cruelty, tragedy and betrayal. But first, before we get into the meat of it, let's talk about some basics formatting stuff. Book is about 500 pages long. Absolutely nothing to complain about in terms of the formatting. Is very clean and easy to read. The cover art made by Peter Bergting is the real thing. I mean, like, look at that. That looks so cool. So first, let's get into a basic overview of the story, with close to no spoilers, very, very mild ones. So the world of The Left Hand of God is kind of like an alternate reality to the world that we try to escape from when we're reading. It's kind of like a melting pot of reality and fantasy. We have real locations, people, religions that are all reimagined by the author to create a very, very confusing but also very captivating world. So we get to explore the story of a young teenage boy referred to as Thomas Cale. And I say referred to because we don't actually know his real name or age, as his parents sold him for a couple of silver pieces to the priests of the one true faith, referred to as the Redemirs. Basically be recruited and trained into a soldier to protect their faith. And the one true faith is the first direct link that we have to the real world, as the religion was started by a figure they refer to as the hanged Redemir, who died on a cross for our sins. And I'm sure you know where that's going. The Redemirs are not your goody two-shoes priests, however. They're the most violent, merciless, and extreme characters that you encounter in the book. And the training that they put these young recruits through is truly horrific. But while the training is quite inhumane, it's certainly very effective, as the Redemirs are one of the biggest powers in the world. And they produce some of the most cold-blooded and talented killers in the universe of The Left Hand of God, as evident by Cale and his two closest friends, for example, Vake Henry and Kleist. While there's no shortage of deadly kids at the Sanctuary, which is the fortress where the Redemirs train their recruits, Thomas Cale, of course, stands out, as you would expect from a protagonist, with his superhuman-like combat ability, where he's basically able to predict his opponent's movements based on like the slightest muscle twitch or eye movement, and he's able to know exactly what his opponent is going to do next and react to it in like milliseconds. And the second part of his ability, which is his battle IQ, is not explored too deeply, at least initially in the book. It's kind of like dove into in more detail later on, but basically he's able to take into account the slightest details and factors of a battle and just devise a complete master plan that basically almost guarantees victory. So he would take into account everything from the terrain to the number of soldiers to the weapons used by both armies to the resources available to the armies. And of course, as you'd expect, those abilities are so unexplainable in the world that the Radomirs started creating theories about how he could potentially have acquired those. So they created a theory that something must have switched in his brain when he got a head injury during his training. And obviously they tried to recreate that because it's such a good idea, right? They wanted to create basically an army of Thomas Kales, people that can predict their opponent's movements. So they tried to recreate the head injury, which of course resulted in a whole bunch of kids dead. And of course they were not able to recreate it. So that has granted Thomas Kale some special extra attention from the Lord Militant of the Sanctuary, which is basically the big boss. And he has put Thomas Kale through like extra training, extra studies and all that to make him into like a true killing machine to help them win their great war against the antagonists, which are basically like heretics, that want to defile the one true faith. So, one cold night, Kale stumbles upon something so horrific and ungodly that against his better judgment, he decides to deliver justice himself right there and then, which prompts what is the beginning of the story, which is his great escape from the sanctuary. An escape on which, of course, he drags his friends along. And after a few very, very close calls and some incredibly smart decisions from Kale, they managed to reach the city of Memphis, which is the capital of the kingdom of the Materazzi, or Materazzi. I don't really know how to pronounce that properly. If you do know, make sure to let me know down in the comments. But basically, in Memphis, they are completely safe from the Radomirs because the power of the Materazzi is comparable to, if not greater than, the power of the priests. So while the lives of Kale and his friends are certainly more comfortable and much less physically painful, they have to deal with some problems that they never imagined they would have. For example, they were brought into the sanctuary from extremely young ages, right? From like 2-3 years old. There's no women at the sanctuary because they're a distraction, right? So obviously now teenage boys are in this big city and they're seeing all these women and they have to deal with all these political and social situations that they're not familiar with. So it's a whole new bunch of problems that they need to deal with, and all of these emotions that they've never felt, or they didn't even know that those feelings exist, or they could feel those feelings. With all these crazy new problems, Memphis is basically where the story really takes off. I'm gonna stop here in terms of the little introduction to the story. Yeah, let's move on to what I disliked about the book, because I like to get the bad out of the way first to hopefully end on a good note. So the first real negative I would like to talk about is the ending. It's basically like it's a cliffhanger, but not a good one. And of course, this is the first part of a trilogy, so we don't expect a grand conclusion, but it should still have a meaningful conclusion. For example, even if you take something like The Lord of the Rings, the first and the second parts both have nice, meaningful conclusions to them. First one ends when the Fellowship splits apart, right? We have the conclusion of the Fellowship. Second one, we have the conclusion of the Isengard arc. Isengard is dealt with, In this book, the ending is, it just drags on for a few more chapters than it should, in my opinion. Like, if the book ended after the big battle at Silbury Hill, and Kale learns the big bad news about what's happening back in Memphis, that would have been a very good place to end it, because we have a conclusion of a big problem, and we have the teasing of the what the fuck happened back home, you know. Instead, it drags on for a few more chapters, and it just kind of like fizzles out. I mean, they're very good chapters in terms of like what's happening in them, but it's not a good ending. They would work so much better as the first few chapters of the second book, if we would just end the first book after the big battle. I think that would have worked much better. But obviously, like, that could be viewed, honestly, that could be viewed as a positive or negative in regards to the ending. If you enjoyed the book as a whole, you enjoyed the journey, and you can't wait to jump into the second book, you probably wouldn't even really care about the ending of this one, because, you know, you just like jump into the next story and you don't really consider this like a ending or anything. But if you've read this book and you don't really feel like reading the next one, then you will be left very, very disappointed with the ending. Another small complaint that I would have is the mixed naming of the locations in this book. Basically mixing fantasy and real world locations. It's a very cool idea, and I like where Hoffman was going with it, but the execution made it like, it was just very confusing to follow along, and it was hard to separate the actual real world locations of where they actually are in the world, and to actually place them into this world that Hoffman was creating. So it's very hard to imagine where you are in the world at any given point, which honestly, like, for me, it's a big no, because like I want to be able to follow the journey in the world. So it just kind of breaks the immersion for me quite a lot. Another little thing, well, not really a complaint, but more so like a wish that I would have done differently, is I would have liked to know exactly why the book and the trilogy are called The Left Hand of God a little earlier than the last chapter. Basically not talked about throughout the entire book, and it's basically just like fully laid out in the last chapter of the book. Like, you can make assumptions, pretty accurate assumptions, as to why it is called that, which is why it's not really a complaint. But I would have liked if they had like even like one chapter where they kind of talk about why the book is called that, you know? They kind of lay out the foundation, like a solid foundation for you to stand on. But they only really talk about it in the last chapter, which is, it could be viewed as like a cool thing, honestly, but I don't know. It was kind of strange, in my opinion. And the last little negative I'd like to talk about is there's one character to which we are introduced very early on in the story, and they have a crucial part in the story. They are basically made to look like they are someone very important, but once the boys reach Memphis, which is quite early in the book, that character basically starts fizzling out and basically just disappearing altogether, reappearing only to like say like a few words and then disappearing into nothingness again. It was just very weird to read, because like the way it's written, it's like you expect the character to have a big part in the story, but like after like a few chapters they basically start disappearing, and they have like basically no input in the story whatsoever afterwards. Maybe Hoffman will bring that character back in the second one, I don't know. But honestly, it was just very weird to read, because like I said, it was just, it looked like the character was gonna be someone very important, but they weren't. They basically disappeared. So now with all the little negatives out of the way, let's move on to the positives. Let's move on to the good parts. While we finished the negatives talking about a character that didn't turn out to be as important as I thought they'd be, I am honestly amazed with all the characters in the book. Like, you can really see how much Paul Hoffman really cared about every single character that he's created. Each and every one of them, no matter how small their contribution to the story is, they feel unique and real. They all have their own unique personalities and set of values that they follow. There's no a wish-wash character that you can just throw away in the book. They are all written with extreme care and precision, which I loved. So while on the topic of characters, I'd like to talk a little bit about the development of our protagonist. The kid that we meet at the beginning is very different from the kid that we discover once he leaves Sanctuary, and is very different from the character that we're left with at the end of the book. And this somewhat drastic change can be quite off-putting for a lot of people, and it has been, because I've seen quite a few people complain about that online. Honestly, I love what the writer did here. Being able to discover all these levels to Kale that initially were not really they were not visible at all. Like, he seemed like a very one-dimensional character, just this cold-blooded analytical killer. Seeing all those levels to him has created like a really captivating protagonist. While Kale's personal journey might not be the most exciting read for everyone, because he basically turns from a cold-blooded killer to a confused teenager there for a bit while he's in Memphis. It's certainly like a very important part of the story to develop Kale into a really good and captivating protagonist. He basically turns from a one-dimensional character into someone who has so much depth that you feel like you know him, but you don't really know how he's gonna react to the next problem that is thrown at him, because he's just develops so much and discovers so many new things about himself that it just becomes a very interesting and unpredictable journey. Besides Kale, if I had to pick my favorite character in the book, I would say it's definitely Idris Puk, a name which I am certain I'm pronouncing wrong once again. But I love that character. He's basically like a medieval version of Tony Stark. He is that rich kid who does not give a fuck about anything, but at the same time is super smart and can like talk his way out of almost any situation. His whole vibe and demeanor is just super cool, and like it's just so fun to read whenever he's in the scene. It's just so fun to read because he just like always comes up with like the funny, like snappy, jokey answer, and it's just really entertaining. I would also like to point out that Kale's like mental struggles and how he deals with problems and his whole decision making in those hard situations is written just masterfully by Hoffman. You can really, when you're reading them, you can really feel the struggle that Kale goes through. And it's very easy to connect with him in that regard. I just love the way that it was written. It was just written extremely well. Also, the pacing of the whole story I very liked as well. It starts off obviously very dark and slow with the sanctuary at the beginning, then the constant action of the escape, then it slows down again, and once we reach Memphis, and crazy action again at the end. But even the slow parts of the story, like the Memphis, they never feel like meaningless filler. Every single part feels like it's used to just delve into like a specific character, to discover like a personality trait or a part of the backstory of a character that we didn't know before. It's always used to progress the story and to deepen it. So honestly, the pacing of the book is also just done extremely well. So to round up this review, although quite confusing, The Left Hand of God it's an amazing book. Although the ending is like I mentioned, not so much to my liking. The whole journey that Paul Hoffman takes us on here, it's so captivating. I'm gonna jump into the second book straight away. Amazing characters, great action, and so emotional drama. Honestly, that like the book has everything. From action to the slow parts, you will find something to your liking in the book. I'm sure of it. Honestly, there's no other book that I could compare The Left Hand of God to. Like Paul Hoffman really has created something original here with this one. So nothing I've read really compares. If you've read something that you think would compare to this one, make sure to drop it down in the comments so I can check it out and other people can as well. Speaking of that, I would definitely recommend this book to anyone who enjoys like dark and heavy themes, which are quite prevalent, especially at the beginning. And anyone who would like a break from like the traditional heroic character that just wants to make everyone feel good, because that's something that I'm personally very bored of. All these like superhero movies and stuff like that. It just became super oversaturated with the main characters that are just want to save everyone, and they have like these perfect morals. Kale does not give a fuck about a lot of things, and it's just really refreshing to just have a main character who just doesn't really, he still has strong morals, but he doesn't give a fuck most of the time. So it's just a very enjoyable read. And honestly, like if you just enjoy like some good fictional medieval times adventure, then you would enjoy this too. So with all that being said, what's the rating for The Left Hand of God? Considering everything, I think The Left Hand of God sits comfortably at a 7 out of 10. It's on the borderline of being an 8 out of 10, but the world is just a little too confusing for me. It's a little too hard to follow, and I just lose that immersion of the world where I can't properly follow it. But it's almost an 8, but it sits very, very strongly at a 7. So that concludes our first review on the reader's block, with The Left Hand of God taking a strong 7 out of 10. I'm gonna jump straight into the second book in the series, called The Last 4 Things. So that will be the next review coming your way. Hope you enjoyed. I hope I was able to give you a little insight into my general thoughts on the book. Maybe you agreed with some of them, maybe you didn't agree with some of them. Let me know down in the comments, and also make sure to drop your personal rating in the comments as well if you have read the book already as well. Give me some tea recommendations for all the British people as well. Give me some tea recommendations, and yeah, I'll hopefully catch you in the next episode of the Reader's Block or any other content that I put out.